She's got 10,000.
All right, I think we should just kick off, and if people join, Michelle, if you'll just let them in. So thank you. This is our fourth lunch hour series webinar hosted by the KZN Society of Mediators. And I'm so thrilled that Lynette Le Roux has agreed to talk, because I personally feel very passionate about the Voice of the Child interview. It is part of the Children's Act to hear the children's take their views into consideration. And I think there's not always enough understanding around who does this, when do they do it, can the mediator do a Voice of the Child, does it have to be a psychologist, social worker, and so on. So Lynette is a clinical psychologist. She's got a PhD in child and forensic psychology, and she specializes in psycho-legal and forensic work. So children is your thing, hey, Lynette? She's been on various, chairperson of EXCO, various boards, a chairperson of SOM, the South African Association of Mediators, and SOMLA Accreditation Committee, and currently is the chairperson of the Forensic Forum. And Lynette does a lot of forensic assessments, mediation, family law mediation, and more the court is actually calling on her to be parenting coordinator in high conflict situations, or matters of high conflict. So with all that experience and all your passion, Lynette, thank you so much for joining. We're going to, Lynette will present for maybe 35 or 40 minutes. If there are questions, please put them in the chat and we'll deal with them afterwards so that you don't forget them. Otherwise, yes, we'll have a discussion afterwards just on the nitty-gritty of Voice of the Child. So I'm going to let you carry on. Thank you, Lynette.
Thank you very much, Joanne, and thank you everybody for being here and giving me the opportunity to speak about something that I do feel very passionately about, and it's really important that the voice of the child is obtained in the correct way. Okay, so there are really just 5 points that I want to run through very briefly, and those being the reason for the voice of the child, when should it be done, who should do a voice of the child assessment, or who should obtain the voice of the child, the process to follow in doing a voice of the child, and then misconceptions or limitations to it and ethical pitfalls and things like that. So hopefully we'll try and get through all of that as quickly as possible so that we can have a bit of a discussion, because I think that's where actually it is most helpful and we all learn a lot in discussion, I think. So the reason for the voice of the child, as Joanne said, it's actually part of the Children's Act. Section 10, even, and it's a very short section, basically says that in any matter involving a child, that dependent on the age of the child and level of maturity, and I'm going to come back to that later on, that their voice must be obtained, and that it must be given due consideration. So the reason for it is because it's part of our law. I mean, first and foremost, okay. And so we have to actually get it. And I think for good reason. I fully agree with the concept. But another reason for it is that just because a child is a child doesn't mean to say that they don't have feelings about whatever it may be, whatever the situation is. But so, it is their lived-in experience, and they will have opinions on that, on what they want, and that must be taken into consideration. So I think, I think from a more personal or psychological point of view, I think it's very important that we get the voice of the child. It's important that children feel heard. You often hear kids saying, but kind of like, nobody ever asked me. In fact, there is a therapeutic game now called Nobody Asked Me, and it's actually a game to play with children whose parents have separated, divorced, whatever the scenario is, to deal with kind of all of all of the implications of mum and dad not being together, and how they struggle with that, what their feelings are. I do just quickly want to say in this that I'm going to talk about mum and dad, and I'm going to talk about a divorce scenario, let's say, okay, just for ease of discussion. But I do want to just highlight that it could be mum and mum or dad and dad, because we do live in a society now where we have a lot of families where the two parents are of the same sex, and they have a child together through whatever means, and then they get divorced. So we need to be mindful of that it could be, two parents of the same sex. And the other thing too is that I'll talk about divorce, but it could be that the parents were never married. And so they were in a long-term living relationship, and now they are separating. And so just for ease of discussion, and to quicken it up, I'm going to actually just keep using the idea of mum and dad and divorce. I do just also want to highlight there that for children, whether mum and dad were together and not married and now separating, or whether they were married and now are divorcing, for children, divorce happens when mum and dad separate. The legalities and the paperwork that go is often not for them what's important, unless they start getting influenced and told about things by mum and dad. But anyway, so it's important to know that actually when mum and dad separate, for them psychologically and emotionally, that's when the divorce happens. Anyway, so the reasons that we've gone through, okay, when should the voice of the child be done? Well, in actual fact, when anything happens that involves the child. So I've done voice of the child assessments in different scenarios, not when there's a divorce. For example, when mum and dad are already divorced, and that often happens, or mum and dad have been separated for a long time, and there's a dispute around something to do with the child or the children, and the children's voices need to be obtained. Their views, their wishes need to be heard. So I can think of one now that I did relatively recently, where this was a 13-year-old girl, and she was finishing primary school now at the end of this year, and she wanted to go to boarding school. And mum was in favor of it, and there were a number of reasons why she wanted to go to boarding school. Not all negative ones, actually some quite positive ones. And mum was, kind of supportive of it. And dad was very anti it because, in my opinion, and it wasn't for me to do the investigation, but basically, I don't think he wanted to pay the extra school fees. So he was very resistant to it. And so I did a voice of the child in terms of what did she want and why did she want it? And then produced a report on that. So it could be anything. It's often post-separation and divorce where there's now a request by either parent or by the child or children for a change in the contact schedule, or sometimes even change in residency. And mum and dad are now at loggerheads about it, and so the child's opinions have to be taken into account. So basically anything that involves the children. I've never done, I have to be honest, I've never done a formal voice of the child assessment when mum and dad are still together, I have to say. But I suppose in my work, in some sort of way, I have done that, not so formally, where for example, there might be the child, there's a question around the child changing schools. maybe from an academic school to a more technically oriented school, and the parents are wanting to know what would be best for the child, what does the child really feel. And so that actually still would be actually a voice of the child. Anyway, so assessment of a different nature, where hopefully there isn't all the high levels of acrimony that we often deal with when mom and dad can't talk to each other. So so anytime. Who should do the voice of the child? Okay, so Joanne alluded to this in the introduction, and this is a big contentious issue. Okay, so I'm going to say it straight up. Okay, I believe that actually it needs to be a mental health practitioner. Okay, so we're looking at a social worker or a psychologist who would obtain the voice of the child. And I understand that is maybe a little contentious, because I think that there are a lot of other people who think that they can actually obtain the voice of the child. And so one of the groups of people that I think also feel they can are religious leaders, pastors or some sort of religious leader, where there is some sort of dispute around what should happen with the child, or in terms of whatever. And they then feel that they can actually obtain that voice. And I have nothing against religious leaders, quite honestly. I think they're very valuable people and we really need them. But everybody has their limitations. And I'm not sure, unless it's around something that is actually to do with religion, that a religious leader really has the skills to do an assessment on a child, especially around residency and contact. So I know that a lot of attorneys also feel that they can do it. And I'm not saying that attorneys aren't sensitive and wise, okay, but we all have our limitations. I'm not an attorney, and I would not give legal advice to a child, like a curator leader might, okay, or when a child has their own attorney appointed, which does happen. I don't know about so much in KZN, but up here in Johannesburg, it's happening more and more. So that's not my role. I'm not an attorney. And so I do think we need to stay in our lanes and do what we do best. And so it worries me when people who are not properly trained then think that they can obtain the voice of the child and feed it back into the mediation or whatever it is. So often this does happen in a mediation scenario where a parenting plan is being mediated, and the mediator, who is an attorney who obviously is well qualified to be mediating, as long as they've had training in mediation, is mediating, and then they say, okay, well, they will do the voice of the child, because we all know that with parenting plans, we have to sign off the regulation forms, and one of the forms is that we say, as the mediator, that the child's voice has been obtained. It also says, by the way, that the contents of the parenting plan have been fed back to the child. The child's been informed of the contents. And I don't often hear about that being spoken about much, but actually it's the same. It's on that form, and we're actually signing that that's happened. And it worries me then when an attorney who's doing the mediation then says, no, that they will get the voice of the child. Okay. It worries me even further, even much more, when I hear of attorneys where there is an actual divorce matter before the court, and it's opposed, and the attorney says, no, but I've spoken to the children, so I know what their opinions are. And I'll tell you why I'm saying I worry about that, okay? One, it's because of the training, because actually obtaining a voice of the child is not so simple, okay? It's not, I will say, it's not sitting the child down and saying, okay, so tell me, where do you want to live? What do you want? It's not that. And it's not that for many reasons. because children are influenced, because, and I'm not even talking about direct influence. I'm, kind of, if parents are so stupid to literally try and coach their children to say something, it often goes badly. But it can often, but the influence is often far more subtle, and it's far more insidious, and it's been a process that's been going on. So the child doesn't know that they've been influenced. And the person hearing what the child is having to say wouldn't really even maybe be able to pick it up that the child's been influenced. And it really takes quite a lot more than just sitting and talking to the child about what their opinions are in order to really get their true voice. So another reason why I don't think it should be an attorney is because children, especially younger children, but really into their young teenage years, in fact, because of the developmental stages and our intellectual development, your primary school child is in a developmental phase and cognitively in a phase where everything's very black and white. It's right or wrong. There's no gray, okay? And courts are seen to be where people who have done something wrong get taken to and they get punished, okay? I suppose the far more important nuances of a judicial system, children don't understand it at that age, okay? So if they go to see mom's attorney or dad's attorney or even their own attorney sometimes, or they get called into the judge's chambers, because that sometimes happens too, they see that as being they are going to court and they can get into trouble because it's right and wrong. And I'm a kid, these are adults, and in fact, this is the judge. They see attorneys as judges. Okay, they don't understand the difference. Okay, so they walk into that with incredible fear because they think they could get into trouble and go to jail. Children know about jail, okay, and so they're worried that they're going to go to jail. So if they say something that in their minds they think might be seen as being wrong and bad of them, they will then get sent to jail. So their level of anxiety and fear is extreme. So to go to an attorney and be asked, where do you want to live? What position does that put the children in? Okay. And then, so as is often the case, when a child says something and you're not quite sure about what they mean by that, you say, I don't really understand. Can you explain that to me? Or, kind of, I'm not sure I heard that correctly. Can you tell me again? Okay. They interpret that as being, I must have given the wrong answer, so better I answer something different. It's actually terrible, but it's very true for children. And sometimes when I've been involved actually in abuse cases more than anything, where children have to give evidence through an intermediary, I've seen it happen many times where the child gets asked the same question over and over again, in maybe slightly different ways, but it's the same question, or with another question in between, and they come back to that question. And it's a technique. It's a technique to make the child then give a different answer, and then it's like, well, this is an unreliable witness. Anyway, that's another discussion. Okay, so children. So that's why also I don't think that the legal setting is the right place for a child's voice to be obtained. And so therefore, I think it's more your mental health practitioners who need to be doing that, who are trained, because there are mental health practitioners, by the way, who are not trained in this either. And so likewise, I would say that they too should not be doing it, because we all have our areas of speciality. So it might be something that, yes, I specialize in, but there are many areas of psychology that I don't specialize in, and I should not be working on cases like that. because I haven't got the knowledge, I haven't got the expertise. So it's not just the professions as a blanket rule, it's about with the right profession and the right expertise within it. The process to follow in doing a voice of the child. Okay, so that's quite important. That's very important, and that's a big discussion, and that's like a whole day training on the actual process. But just to highlight a few things, okay. Some of the things with the voice of the child is you need to decide straight up in the beginning, okay. Is that person, so especially if you are the mediator, okay, do you want the person doing the, let's say the social worker or psychologist doing the voice of the child assessment for you, do you want them to consult with the parents first or not? And so so that's a big question, and it's quite an important one, okay. So do the parents get consulted beforehand and then the child or children then go through their assessment process? Or should it be what we call a blind assessment, okay, where it's the instruction really is just that mum and dad are getting divorced and we need a voice of the child with regard to residency and care and contact, okay. That's age appropriate for that child. Okay, the reason why I say that is because either is actually fine. It all depends on the case, okay? And as the mediator, you would hopefully have spoken to the parents about it. And if it is that the parents are going to be consulted, both parents have to be consulted, not necessarily together. Okay, you can have individual consults with your psychologist or social worker, but it's either both of them or neither of them. It's not one and not the other, and that's quite important, because I think it stands to reason. If you have just the dad consulting with the person and then they do the voice of the child assessment, and when the results, when the feedback is given, okay, the let's say the social worker says something that mom does not agree with, she's going to say, but you know what, I never got to tell her what I thought. Well, I didn't, so it's just going to, you can understand that. I mean, I think it's actually a valid comment. So I think that's important. Okay. And I say it's valid in that I think it's valid in terms of legal principle, but in terms of the voice of the child, well, if you're doing a voice of the child properly, actually it shouldn't really matter, because you're getting the child's voice. You shouldn't be influenced by what either one of the parents do or don't say. But so that's the one thing, either both or neither, okay. But I want to just quickly ask you something, and I'm not going to use up time to get people to respond, but I want you to respond in your own head, okay. At what age do you think a child has a voice? At what age are they old enough to be able to kind of have a voice, to be able to say what they would want with regard to residency and contact? So when I do this and then I ask for kind of input from the people in the room, it's quite interesting. So a lot of people will say, oh, when the child, and you're welcome to put you're welcome to put your ideas in the chat box if you want, okay, if you're brave enough, well done, okay. But a lot of people will say, oh, well, when the child, sometimes I hear when the child's 12, okay. Others will say, oh, when the child's about 7 or 8, because then they can understand what, okay, the implications, okay, that when they can talk, okay, that's really young. Children start talking from the age of 1, usually, okay, with single words, and by the age of 2, they're putting words together in little short sentences. Okay, so some of the arguments against these very young ages are things like, well, the child doesn't understand the full implications of what they're saying, okay. So my answer to that is, okay, a child, our experience of anything is our lived in experience right there and then. Okay, I'll give you a very different example. The concept of death changes for us as we go through different developmental stages. Okay, so the last developmental stage, by the way, that we all go through is the process of dying. Okay, and depending on your faith, it may not be the end, it might be the beginning, but that's in terms of our human existence, that is the last developmental phase. Okay, the dying. And your idea of what death is about and your understanding of death is very different from at the age of 5 compared to the age of 75. And in terms of what you grapple with. Okay. And I think you can understand that. I don't think we have to go into a lot of detail around that. So when we're looking at a child and what and where should they live and getting their voice, okay, a 5-year-old's what they're saying and their lived in experience is very different to a 15-year-old's. Okay, so what do we do? At what age should a child be able to give their voice, give their opinion? Okay, so my opinion is that it's from birth. Okay, and I know that that's like, what? Okay, and I'll tell you why I say that. Okay, because why are we, there are a couple of things. Why are we relying on spoken word? When we say the voice of the child, we kind of automatically kind of jump to, okay, what they say. But that's not what the voice of the child necessarily is. We all know, I think everybody in this room knows well, that children can be influenced. And I've already mentioned it briefly. Okay, so then why are we relying on the spoken word if we accept that children can be influenced in what they say? The other reason why I say that that's wrong, oh, sorry, that's the phone ringing, it'll get answered, Leanne will answer it. The other reason is that we all know that most of our communication is nonverbal. Okay, less than 50%, in fact, it's quite a lot less, we now know, than 50%. Less than 50% of our communication is verbal, because we now know that there's actually other, not only is it nonverbal in terms of our behavior and things like that, that we also have something called mirroring, which is when the neurons in the front of our brain talk to each other. On a completely different level, which is we now know that thing of intuition is actually true. So I often say, when you're in mediation, be careful what you're thinking, because they are picking it up, literally. You know, when you get that feeling like somebody doesn't believe in you, or somebody doesn't trust you, or somebody doesn't like you, they haven't said anything, you just get that sense, that's that. It's real. Okay. So a lot of our communication is nonverbal. So why are we relying on what the child says? And for those reasons, I am then saying we can do a voice of the child literally from birth, because you do an interactional evaluation. So then you set up the situation where you are watching mom interacting with the child or infant, and then dad interacting with the child or infant. And that's one of the big reasons why it needs also to be a social worker or psychologist. But it needs to be either a social worker or psychologist that does it, who is trained to do an interactional evaluation. If they don't know how to do it, they don't know what to look for. So an interactional evaluation will tell you what a 3-month-old's relationship with mom is like and what a 3-month-old relationship is like with dad. Okay, that is the child's voice. It is their lived-in experience of that relationship. It will tell you about where the attachment process is. It tells you about the parent being able to pick up on the child's cues etc., etc. So that's even with a real little an infant. Obviously, as the children get older, you can still do an interactional evaluation, and it tells you a wealth of information in terms of that relationship, which is the child's voice. They are telling you how they feel about that parent. And so the process to follow is one that is not just sitting the child down and saying, tell me about what it's like at mom's house. Tell me what it's like at dad's house. What's good, what's not good at mom's house. What's not good, what's good at dad's house. Who do you want to live with, type of thing. It is so much more than that, and so much more complex. Part of the process too is also to be aware of and to look for influence, because if we think that parents are not trying to influence their children more or less, I think we're being naive. I would never say never, okay, because that's always dangerous to say. But I think say that it would be extremely rare to find that a mom and dad have not, in some way, even just very subtly, tried to influence their child a little bit. Often they don't even know they're doing it because they're being driven by their own needs, remember? Okay, so, sometimes it's a subconscious process that's coming from that parent. But it is influencing the child. And when you start looking at things like issues like the parentified child and the adultified child, where they've been put in a role that they are not equipped for, and they've been put there by a parent because of the parent's own struggles and psychological challenges, let's say, and inadequacies. And the child has been placed in this role that makes the child feel they're responsible for the parent. That's going to influence what a child says, obviously. And if you're not alert to that, you're going to miss that. So, yeah, okay. So I think I've said enough about that. Okay. There's obviously lots more to say about that, though. Misconceptions and ethical pitfalls and the limitations. Okay. I wanted to quickly touch on that. So the misconceptions, I think I've kind of touched on in terms of it's not just sitting the child down and saying, where do you want to live? It's not about spoken word, I'm not saying you ignore the spoken word, but it's not just about that. In fact, that's a small part of what a voice of the child assessment should be. There's so much more to it. And obviously psychological tests that we can use are also very useful because they give you a lot of extra information that the child is not aware so if they've been coached and influenced, the tests get past that and see underneath that. And that's where that's very, very useful. So that's one of the misconceptions, that it's not just the spoken word. Some of the limitations are, though, or the ethical pitfalls are that a voice of the child is not a full psycholegal assessment. So a voice of the child should not, does not encompass a lot of comments around the parent's psychological functioning. If you're wanting that information, then you need to have a psycholegal assessment done on the family. But it's not about that. It's about the child's lived-in experience of their relationship with mom and dad. That's actually what it's about when we're looking at mediation in divorce. Okay, so it's limited to that. Okay, if one of the other limitations that are important to note is that if the person conducting the assessment has not consulted with mom and dad, ethically, they cannot make any recommendations around residency and or contact. Okay. And for good reason, because they haven't heard mom and dad's opinions on that. Okay. And my hair stands on end when I hear reports where a report has been written on a voice of the child assessment and one of the parents has been consulted, which for a start shouldn't be done, and then they give recommendations about where they think the child should live. No, a voice of the child is not that. Okay, actually, the voice of the child anyway, even if mum and dad have been consulted, is really to say, this is what mum says, this is what dad says, this is what the child's assessment, because it's not just the child's spoken word, child's assessment shows, and this should be given due consideration. Okay. Because it's about the voice of the child. The voice of the child assessment is to place before actually mum and dad, sometimes the court, but mum and dad, what the child is saying, remember psychologically, not verbally, would be best in that child's experience, not opinion, but experience. Okay, so I do know that a lot of voice of the child assessments get done where it says that recommendations are made around residency and contact. Okay, and that's strictly speaking actually not a voice of the child. Okay, it might have been the brief that was given, and I understand that they're fulfilling the brief, but strictly speaking, that's not a voice of the child assessment. I wouldn't get too uptight about it if mom and dad have both been consulted and then a proper process has been followed, that those sorts of recommendations are made, but then mom and dad need to have agreed to that beforehand. But strictly speaking, that's actually what we would call a limited psycholegal assessment. So limited in terms of it's not a full assessment on the whole family. So yeah, and then the ethical pitfalls are that actually I think that if you are the mediator and you obtain the voice of the child, okay, whether you're a social worker, psychologist, attorney, whatever, okay, if you're the mediator and you then say, okay, well, fine, I will speak to the children and get what their opinion is. I think that's dual roles. And I think that's a big ethical pitfall. And in my opinion, it's a no-no. I'm a psychologist and I can do a voice of the child, absolutely. But if I'm mediating, then I want somebody else to do it. For the simple reason, think about it. Here I am mediating with mum and dad. Now we need that, and they can't agree on residency, okay, or the contact schedule, okay. So yes, you're going to be getting the voice of the child. So I do the voice of the child. I hear from the child. The child's opinion is that it works best, let's call it, okay, that he lives with dad. Now I've got to go back into the mediation, sit with mum and dad and say to them, okay, so I've done a bit of an assessment on your child. And basically what that shows is that, it's his lived-in experience that it would be best to live with dad. How do you think mom's going to feel? Okay. And now I want her to sit with me and continue mediating happily. How fair is that on her? I mean, I'm not saying that it wouldn't be right for the kid to live with dad. It may well be the case. It's not for me to have an opinion on that, though, quite frankly, as the mediator. But how fair is that on mum? Okay. So yeah. So I think that it, for good reason, that would be considered to be dual roles, and I think the rest of the mediation could really be jeopardized. Okay, so I want to stop there because I'm very mindful of the time, and now I've used up even too much time, and we only have 15 minutes for question. And I think I've seen a couple of questions come up that are quite interesting. So let's go through them and any other questions that may pop up.
Oh, thank you, Lynnette. I mean, I've got a few questions, but Naresh has asked, would you say that the staff at the Family Advocate's Office are qualified to hear the voice of the child?
Okay, so the family counsellors, I can't say they're not qualified, okay. I will say I don't think the advocates are qualified, but the family counselors, because they are usually social workers, should be qualified. Let me put it that way. And they, unless there's good reason to doubt it, I would accept that they are qualified. The issue becomes, do they have capacity to do a proper voice of the child assessment? Because I used to, many years ago, when it was still done, I used to go and assist at the family advocate's office in complex matters, where they used to use outsiders on a pro bono basis to come and help them. And I know what their caseloads are like and their time constraints. And you cannot tell me, I'm sorry, you cannot tell me that in 15, 20 minutes, even half an hour, which is they usually don't even have half an hour out, okay, that you can properly assess the child's voice in that time. Because as I've said, it's not about saying, tell me about mom's house, tell me about dad's house, where do you want to live? Because that's literally what happens at the family advocate's office. So they are qualified on one level, but I don't think that they do it properly. And I have some serious problems sometimes with what comes out of there, I have to say. I'm sorry.
And then the family advocates offices are obviously different wherever you go.
Yes.
Risha, does that help? Okay, thanks. And then Ishara asked, can a VOC assessment also be used in a situation, for example, where both parents have died and the child needs to be placed in foster care or with other family members? And I suppose then the question is who does it?
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good example, okay, of where it's slightly different from your normal divorce scenario, where absolutely a voice of the child can be done. And it may be quite an extensive one then, because if you're looking at where to place the child, say, for example, with various different family members, you may need to do interactional evaluations with the child or the children and the different family members to see what those relationships are like. Those interactional evaluations are so valuable and so rich in information in terms of the emotional connection between the child and the person or people. So it could be that there's an aunt and uncle on the one side and an aunt and uncle on the other side and a gran. Okay, so the aunts and uncles, I would do the interactional evaluations with the aunt and uncle and the child or children together, but that's my style. Somebody else may prefer to do each adult or each potential parental figure individually with the child to look at the different relationships. But absolutely, it would be a really good thing to do, in that scenario.
Sorry, Lynnette, in terms of process, you also said whether the parents get spoken to first or consulted with first and then the child, or the child first, is neither here nor there, and it'll be case-by-case basis. But the parents always do need to be consulted before any kind of recommendation.
No, not necessarily. Okay. Not necessarily. So I've done a voice of the child. I've done more than one where I don't consult with the parents at all. Okay. So the either-or situation is you either consult with both or neither. It doesn't matter whether it's before you see the child or after the child. That doesn't matter. But I usually do it before, because if I'm going to be seeing the parents, then I want that history. Okay. And then I will see the child. But it's either both parents individually or together, or neither of the parents at all. Okay. So does that answer your question though, Joanne?
Yes, but in terms of feedback, so you said, but you wouldn't give recommendations unless you had consulted with the parents. So in terms of feedback, do you recommend, I mean, a lot of people say verbal feedback to the mediator is enough.
Yes.
Some people want some sort of written report. Yeah. How do you feel about that?
So good question. Thank you. So my comment on that is that if it's in the mediation, during mediation of a parenting plan, get somebody to do the voice of the child and ask them to come to the next session and feed back verbally what they have found. Okay, what the voice of the child assessment has shown, the information it provides. Okay, why I quite like that is for a number of reasons, but the main reason is because if that person is sitting in the room at the beginning of the mediation session, the parents can get to ask questions then. Like, oh, so you said that it showed this, this, and this, but where did that come from, or how, or but did you consider this, or what about that, or whatever it is. Okay, so I think it actually is. I think the parents have a right to do that. Quite frankly, I think it's nice for them to, but it's more than nice. I think it's important that they then, I suppose, hopefully have faith in the outcome of the voice of the child assessment. So I think that's really useful. Once that's happened, they go, and then you as the mediator carry on with that information in the mediation. Okay. So I think that works best. But yes, some people do want to report, and that's fine, not a problem. It just means you've got to wait for the report, and often that's an extra cost because they will charge for the time taken to draft that report. So yeah, I do think the verbal feedback works so well. It's good. The parents get so much more information out of it.
Okay, and then would you say, I've had different views on this. Some voice the child practitioners feel 2 or 3 sessions is necessary to build trust, first of all, then another session to get the idea, and maybe another session to meet the parents. Others have said 1 session. Obviously, most say children separately, if there's 2 different family or 3 children. So that's, I think, is a given. But in terms of how many, I know sometimes it's case by case basis, but as a general rule of thumb.
Yeah. So definitely, my experience is always the children on their own. So let's say you've got an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old, you would see each of those children on their own. And the way I work, and I can only talk about the way I work and what I usually recommend and do training on, is that you have at least 2 sessions, and you do part of kind of, should we say, the assessment, with obtaining some of the child's opinions and that sort of thing in the 1 session, and then you do the interactional evaluation. So let's say that first session, I arrange, mom brings the child, and I work with the child or each of the children on their own, and then I do the interaction with mom and the children. Some people do separate interactions, mom and the one child, mom and the other child. It's very, very rare that I will do that. It's only if there's very big age differences in the children. So for example, if you've got like a 2-year-old and a 14-year-old, okay, and it can happen, then you might want to do different ones. But on the whole, I want to see that parent managing those 2 children together, and those 2 children together, and how they interact with that parent then. So whether the one child gets ignored or not, or all sorts of things. I mean, it's just so much information that one can get. So and then the next session, because I'd have at least 2 sessions with the children, the next session, dad brings the children. Okay, and I work with each child individually, and then I do dad's interactional evaluation. And then if I need further consults with the children after that, I will then set up those as well, until I feel I'm at a place where I'm sure of what the child's voice is. Okay, the reason why I do 1 with mum, 1 with dad is that because maybe I've just been doing this for too long. I don't know, I'm cynical, or I don't know what, anyway, or too suspicious. But parents will often say, oh, but you know what? Yes, obviously the children actually said that because mum coached them the whole way to the sessions. The children actually told me, mum said we must say this, this, and this. Okay. Now, if the person doing the voice of the child assessment knows what they're doing, they will be alert to that anyway. They should be. Okay. And it's not that hard to find out when a child has been influenced. You just need to know how. Okay. So shame, bless them. And then in all innocence, they tell you, so it's so sweet. Anyway, so if parents are that stupid, then go ahead. But but having said that, though, it is an allegation that's made against, one or both parents make it against the other, kind of their influence. And that's why I divide it like that. I want to have the one parent bring for the one session and the other parent bring for the, literally. And I will sometimes say this to the parents. So you have equal opportunity to go ahead and try and influence your child or children. I mean, I'll just say it. So, but I say that because I want them to be alert to the fact that I know they're going to try, or I suspect they're going to try. Yeah, so that's my process. Okay, I understand that other people may do it differently, and I respect that. And as long as they know why they're doing it and it works for them, because we do have different styles, I'm okay with that. Sure, it would be I don't know that I've ever done a voice of the child in one session. I don't think I ever have. I think I would be too scared to rely on one session, quite honestly. Yeah.
And then, sorry, a last question from me. And if anyone else has got questions, please jot them down, although we've only got a few minutes left. But this I come across fairly frequently in very amicable divorce situations where the parents get on quite fine. Their communication is pretty good. In fact, sometimes the living arrangement has been in place for already a week or two or a month. Mom moved out, the kids live 1 week. And I sit with them and I say, you really do need to do a voice of the child assessment. And they say, and there is no money because we've done the finances. And they say, we've spoken to our kids. They're perfectly fine with this arrangement. Maybe the children are 8 and 10 or whatever. And I'm kind of stuck because I have to say, you have to go and spend the money. But in actual fact, the Children's Act just says, the children's views have to be considered. It doesn't say you have to take them to the person.
Yes.
And then there's a catch-22 where they say, well, our kids are fine. And that's done and dusted. I mean, what I do then is ask them to sign a statement to say, we've taken our children's views into account, because I can't drive to the psychologist and pay for them. How do you feel about that? Do you feel that is a problem sometimes?
Yeah, no, it is, and it's a good question, and it's a very real problem, especially when there isn't the money, and that for me is the big issue, and there often isn't. I mean, my gosh, these things cost a lot of money, so and people are struggling financially, so I get that. So, if the children are young, like 8 and 6 years of age, I would be worried, and I'll tell you why, even if it's a very amicable divorce, because children at that age are really kind of in a developmental phase where they are going to want to please the person in front of them. So, mom talks to them and says, look, daddy and I, we're going to live in separate houses now, and we just need to know, where would you like to live? Okay, so even if mum or each parent asks that question, and they word it in a way that's careful, and the children are not being asked to choose between a parent, they're just being asked, where do you want to live, which in itself I don't think you can ask them, but anyway, the children are really, can you imagine a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old sitting in front of mum saying, no, actually I want to live at the other house, daddy's house, okay? Knowing that they're going to be hurting mum, because that's their issue. They don't want to hurt the parent, okay? Knowing that they're going to be hurting that parent, or angering, even worse, that parent, okay? So they're going to say to that parent what they think that parent will want to know. Because right now, I'm in front of you, mum, and so I need to keep you happy, okay? Because I'm dependent on you right now, okay? An hour later, 2 days later, whatever, they with dad, and he asks them the same thing. They're in the exact same position, but now it's dad in front of them. So it's very, very difficult. So I'm very worried, even in a very amicable situation, whether that's really wise to do. I would say that yes, you know, if there isn't the money to send them to another, to a professional person to do it, you know, I would try and explore if there isn't somebody, a teacher, somebody, which is not ideal because they're not trained, even actually a religious kind of, teacher or leader that would be able to just sit and talk to the kids a little bit about it. I think that would be preferable, not by far ideal, but you know, maybe preferable. But worst case scenario, if none of that's available, then yeah, I think what you do, Joanne, just to get the parents to sign a statement to say that they are in agreement that this is what the children's wishes are. I don't think you can do more than that. You know, the only other thing you could do is for you to speak to the children. But again, I'm really, really worried about that in terms of, yeah, you know, how that's going to go, especially if one of the parents then doesn't like what they hear. And then they're landing up with no mediator as well. Yeah. And yeah.
It's tricky.
It's very tricky when there's no money. Look, the other thing you can do is as if, and it's difficult, hey, to get this, but I mean, you could actually refer them to one of our, you know, somewhere like Tutela, your child welfare, places like that, for a social worker, just to have a consult with each of the children to give you a very short one, because time and writing, drafting, and that is an issue, just a very short paragraph on what, you know, what would be best, you know, what the children's voices are in terms of that. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Shireen has also commented it's important to back up.
I see that, yeah.
News. Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe
it is important.
Yeah, maybe the thing is just to go to greater lengths to impress upon them the importance of an objective evaluation.
Yeah. Look, it's tricky, hey? I mean, when there really is no money, you know, when, you know, it's difficult. I mean, if you're doing mediation for a charitable organization like pro bono or something like that, I mean, there's no money anyway. That's why they're there, and they're getting the mediation done pro bono, you know. But then often these organizations do have somebody you can call on. But that too, actually, that makes me think. I mean, if you've got people that they're paying for the mediation, but they haven't got any more money, I wonder if maybe organizations like pro bono and that wouldn't be able to point you in the right direction of somebody. Oh, another thing you can do is you can sometimes approach the universities and ask if some of like the master students or the honors students in social work and that would, you know, whether you can collaborate with the university for them to get experience, because they're looking for people, they're looking for clients for their students to actually get experience from, you know, doing that sort of work. And then there's no pay involved. So it's really about networking, I guess, eh?
Yeah, it is. And I think also there's a big gap between people with the skills, in particular in voice of the child, and the need. If you think every time there's a
absolutely,
or something's changed in the
for sure.
Life. Yeah. Anyway, I've up. So I just want to say thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
You really put everything into a nutshell, and it is a huge area. I mean, I've been on a webinar with you for 3 hours talking about this. So thank you.
Yes. No, it's a pleasure. I hope it's been helpful. I really do. And hopefully we can chat again soon.
It's been brilliant. Thank you so much.
And I hope, Shirley, you're starting to warm up.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynnette. It's been so interesting. Yes, we underutilize this tool way too much. It is so valuable, definitely.
It's a pleasure. Anytime. Okay. Take care.
Thank you,
okay.
Thank you everyone for joining. Bye-bye.
Thank you for organizing, Jo. That was awesome.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, thank you. I must just stop this recording.